What is going on, guys? It is WrestleGamia here, back with another episode. Now, it may be hard to believe, but WWE Video Games have been around for over 3 decades, ranging from PC games to console games to handheld games and of course, arcade games. Join us now as WrestleGamia looks at part 1 of the evolution of WWE Video Games. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when part 2 drops. Let's waste no further time and get straight into it. 1987's Micro League Wrestling was the granddaddy of them all, at least as far as the WWE video games go. This PC game was released for the Commodore 64 and Atari ST in 1987, featuring some surprisingly good graphics and loyalty to the source material. Gameplay saw players choosing a wrestling move for their opponent, with a computer showing whether you succeeded or failed. The game featured digitized pictures of your wrestler performing the move to create the illusion of movement. While Micro League Wrestling featured some cool features like pre-match interviews, entrance music and text commentary from announcers Jesse the Body Ventura, Bruno Sammartino and Vince McMahon, its gameplay was lacking as it was a turn-based system almost akin to a board game, and there was no real strategy involved. Matches were limited to Hulk Hogan vs Randy Savage or Hulk Hogan vs Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. An expansion pack featured Randy Savage vs the Honky Tonk Man and Hacksaw Jim Duggan vs Harley Race. A second expansion offered the Hulkster vs Ted DiBiase and Jake Roberts vs Rick Rude. Though it was only a text game, Micro League Wrestling set the bar high, which is why the WWF's second game, WWF Wrestlemania, released in 1987, was all but doomed to fail. Arguably one of the worst WWE games ever, WWF Wrestlemania was the company's first game for the Nintendo Entertainment System and featured 6 WWF superstars of Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, Bam Bam Bigelow and the Honky Tonk Man. The game's graphics and gameplay were limited even for 1989, and the game only had one-on-one action. While the moveset was limited, there was variety amongst each wrestler and strengths and weaknesses. For example, wrestlers could not slam Andre the Giant except for Hulk Hogan, while Andre and Bam Bam Bigelow could not perform a move off the top rope. Although to be fair, that really wasn't a hindrance for Bam Bam Bigelow. He did moves off the top rope all the time. The game featured a single-player and multiplayer tournament for the WWF Championship. Its oddest feature were the health power-ups that showed up for specific wrestlers, ranging from a guitar for the Honky Tonk Man and a crucifix for Hulk Hogan. The crucifix may have been useful should the Hulkster join the game of Castlevania. After WWF Wrestlemania, fans weren't expecting much, but the WWF over-delivered with its next game, the 1989 arcade game WWF Superstars. This game showed arcades were still the place to go if gamers wanted the best sound and graphics, and this game is still fondly remembered by wrestling fans and gamers alike. Players would select a tag team comprised of any of the following superstars: Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage, the Honky Tonk Man, the Big Boss Man, or Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Your team competed against other teams, building to a showdown against the Megabucks team of Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant. The gameplay here excelled as wrestlers had character-specific attacks and could perform a much wider range of moves than previous games, including throwing opponents outside the ring and brawling on the floor. A win over the Megabucks saw your team name appear on screen in a newspaper article proclaiming your win as tag team champions. Sadly, gamers would have to wait for the next arcade release for a comparable game, as 1990's WWF Wrestlemania Challenge for the NES just couldn't match WWF Superstars. It did, however, feature more superstars than the previous NES game, offering players a chance to choose from Hogan, Andre the Giant, Macho King Randy Savage, the Ultimate Warrior, the Big Boss Man, Brutus the Barber Beefcake, Ravishing Rick Rude and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. For the first time, players could play as themselves, advancing to the championship level. It also featured a tag team mode and a 3-on-3 Survivor Series mode. But as Nintendo's Game Boy handheld console took off in sales, it was only a matter of time before a WWF game appeared. In 1991, they licensed WWF Superstars for the Game Boy, a basic game that had 5 playable characters. Players had the option of competing for the WWF Championship by defeating the other 4 wrestlers. Despite its limited roster, the game featured a decent variety of moves and allowed players to knock their opponents out of the ring. In 1991, PCs were still far advanced in gaming capabilities, which is why fans of WWF Superstars were delighted at the release of WWF Wrestlemania, a game similar in style to the 1989 arcade game WWF Superstars. Here, the action revolves singles competition, with players selecting from Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, or the British Bulldog to take on Mr. Perfect, the Warlord, this being his only video game in history, Ted DiBiase, the Mountie, or Sergeant Slaughter. This game was released for Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and DOS. But not everyone had the bucks for a PC though, which is why fans of WWF Superstars rejoiced when the arcade game WrestleFest was released in 1991, giving them access to a superior sequel to Superstars. WrestleFest expanded its roster as well as the modes of play. It also allowed players to pump in more quarters for energy, a growing trend at the time. The roster included Hogan, Warrior, Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, Big Boss Man, and was expanded to include Jake the Snake Roberts, Earthquake, Mr. Perfect, Sergeant Slaughter, Demolition Smash, and Demolition Crush. The first mode of play, Saturday Night's Main Event, sees a player form a tag team to compete against other teams until they play the boss team, the Legion of Doom. This was the first game to include a Royal Rumble mode, in which an opponent can be thrown over the top rope, pinned, or submitted. Be sure to check out our video on the evolution of the Royal Rumble match in the top right corner. WrestleFest expanded on the movesets of wrestlers and also featured a double team mode. Up to 4 players could compete at once, making this a hit in the arcades. With the game impossible to match on consoles, the 1992 Game Boy game Superstars 2 could only hope to attract gamers with its steel cage mode. With only 6 wrestlers to choose from, including Sid Justice, and the first game The Undertaker could be played, you might think the game offered more moves including signature maneuvers, but it didn't, making this a weak entry. The same year, the WWF released another game for PCs, the WWF European Rampage Tour. Released for Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64 and MS-DOS, the game saw players select a tag team from Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, The Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage as they battled the Nasty Boys, the Natural Disasters and Money Inc., earning a title match with the Legion of Doom if they defeated their opponents 3 times each. The game featured a variety of moves, gameplay outside the ring including the use of weapons, possibly a first, and different venues where the teams competed, moving from London to Munich to Paris and ultimately New York City, which doesn't happen to be in Europe. The Commodore 64 version was limited to singles matches, with wrestlers battling Typhoon, Erwin R. Shyster and Jerry Saggs in order to earn a championship match against Animal. A very strange choice of wrestlers there. Although superior to console games, this PC game is often seen as a weak entry for home computer gamers. Thankfully, home consoles were advancing and the 16-bit systems Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis offered more capabilities for programmers. 1992's WWF Super WrestleMania was released for the Super Nintendo and Genesis, or Mega Drive as it's called outside the US, but each version was somewhat different. Both games featured Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage and Ted DiBiase, but the Super NES offered gamers 7 other wrestlers: Jake Roberts, The Undertaker, Sid Justice, the Legion of Doom and the Natural Disasters, whereas the Genesis offered 5 other wrestlers: The Ultimate Warrior, Papa Shango, Erwin R. Shyster, the British Bulldog and Shawn Michaels, a first for both Shango and Michaels. Unlike the SNES, the Genesis version featured signature moves for wrestlers and a WWF Championship mode. Both games featured singles, tag team and 4 vs 4 Survivor Series bouts. Fans looking to recreate the magic of the WWF cage matches got their wish when WWF Wrestlemania Steel Cage was released in 1992 for NES and in 1993 for the Sega Master System and the Sega Game Gear. In addition to cage matches, players could battle in singles or tag team matches, choosing from 10 superstars. 1993 saw another WWF game release, this time WWF Royal Rumble, and this one over-delivered, offering superior graphics and sound as well as advanced gameplay. Again, the SNES and Genesis versions differed with the amount of wrestlers they had, as the SNES featured the inclusion of Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, Ted DiBiase, Yokozuna and Tatanka, while the Genesis featured Hulk Hogan, IRS, Jim Duggan, the model Rick Martel, and the Genesis darling Papa Shango. Each superstar had signature moves along with individualized moves. The game also added a 6-man tag to the singles and traditional tag matches, featured the usual WWF Championship tournament, but best of all, featured a Royal Rumble match with up to 6 wrestlers in the ring. Expanded gameplay also included more brawling outside the ring and ref bumps that allowed players to execute illegal moves such as eye rakes. The Sega CD was later introduced, and the system offered new gaming capabilities through the use of a CD-ROM rather than a traditional gaming cartridge, making it possible to display full-motion video, even if it was at 20 frames per second. 1993's WWF Rage in a Cage featured an incredible roster of 20 superstars, the biggest any game had seen at the time. Singles matches included traditional matches, but also brawls where wrestlers competed in a no-holds-barred event with no referee, battling until the opponent's health meter was reduced to nothing, and a steel cage match. The game, which featured video for the first time, included voice ring introductions from Howard Finkel, promos, and replays of wrestlers winning their matches. It also featured a mode where a player was featured on the cover of WWF magazine after winning the WWF Championship. Compared to the Sega CD system, the WWF's NES and Game Boy game WWF King of the Ring had little to offer other than the chance to compete in the King of the Ring tournament. This 1993 game was the last WWF game licensed for NES. The Game Boy version lacked The Undertaker and Bam Bam, while both games lacked signature moves. To its credit, this game had different attributes for each wrestler such as speed, strength, and stamina. One of the triumphs of the 16-bit era was WWF Raw, a game with an impressive roster and variety of moves and matches. The game would introduce new wrestlers such as Doink the Clown, the 1-2-3 Kid, Diesel, Owen Hart, and Luna Vachon. This game upped the ante, featuring specific movesets for each wrestler, finishers, and mega moves. Various matches such as singles, tag, Survivor Series and Royal Rumble are only the beginning, as there are tournaments for the singles and tag team championships, as well as no-holds-barred brawl matches, and Bedlam match, aka a Texas Tornado match, and a Raw Endurance match, which features up to 6-person teams battling in an elimination match, with handicap options available for 6-on-1 matches or any variant. Always willing to copy a popular trend, the WWF combined wrestling with the white-hot popularity of 1992's Mortal Kombat series, which had taken the video game world by storm and generated controversy for its violence and gore. In 1995, WWF Wrestlemania the arcade game invaded arcades, mixing traditional wrestling with the over-the-top fighting elements of Mortal Kombat, such as exaggerated attacks and speciality weapons. There were also ridiculous endings such as The Undertaker ending the match by putting his opponent in a coffin and descending under the ring with a tombstone popping up in its place. The engaging game was rounded out with commentary by Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler, as well as official WWF theme music. The dawn of 5th generation consoles such as PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 meant wrestling games were becoming more realistic. Be sure to tune in for part 2 as we look at the evolution of WWE video games. What are some of your favourite WWE video games from this era? Let us know in the comments down below, subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling video game content.